Welcome to the Hourly Podcast. In today's episode, Preston Sharpston, People Operations Manager at MWB Restaurants, discusses the hiring and retention of hourly workers in the restaurant industry. Sharpston highlights the significance of culture in attracting and retaining employees, noting that people want to work where they feel appreciated and valued. He shares insights on developing a strong culture within a multi-unit setting and the challenges of managing different microcultures within each restaurant. Additionally, Sharpston discusses the high volume of applicants in the industry and the need to wow candidates to really stand out. Enjoy.
This episode is brought to you by JoJo, an AI virtual recruiter powered by Sprockets. Designed for the hourly workforce, JoJo works 24/7 to source, screen, and schedule interviews with the best applicants for your business. JoJo helps reduce employee turnover and time spent hiring so you and your team can focus on other important tasks. To learn more, head to sprockets.ai/JoJo.
No, thanks for being on the podcast, Preston. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a little bit, and it's good to finally put a face to a LinkedIn bio. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the follow on LinkedIn. I need to start creating more content. I've been slacking lately.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So someone doesn't know you or the company you work for. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I am a career people and talent professional. Been in the field for going on 10 years, spanning everything from HR business partnering to corporate recruiting. Right now, I am the head of people for a Whataburger franchisee called MWB Restaurants. We operate across North Alabama and soon East Tennessee. Currently, we have 10 open locations, and we're planning on growing 8 to 10 a year. So lots of exciting things coming our way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so, what attracted you to Whataburger and that franchise group? Because I know, you have a lot of options. You're great at what you do, clearly. And, what got you to that group?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that I was actually consulting with them previously to taking a formal role, and I'd consulted with another restaurant chain before here, which is sort of how I came into the restaurant path.
Yep.
And I remember just really enjoying everyone that I worked with. From the leadership team to our line managers. There was really a strong emphasis on not only how do we hire people, but how do we keep those people and we engage them, and that's something that I think is hard to train people on, to give them that mentality of how do I retain my people and build that strong team. So I think that was probably the biggest picture which attracted me.
Yeah. And, that's what we talk about here on this podcast, of course, is like, how do you attract, how do you hire, and how do you retain quality hourly workers? And that's kind of like the big nut of the industry, right? Is how do we crack it? And, from your perspective, let's start with just hiring. Like, let's break down the hiring motion. Like, what's a great way for a company like a Whataburger to recruit great people? What are some important things to think through?
Yeah, gosh, there are so many things.
Right.
I think at its core, really what we have to focus on is how do we make things easy? How do we make things understandable and digestible? For example, in our application process, it takes maybe 30 seconds if you really take your time with it. So we've engineered that to be seamless for folks to apply through a bunch of platforms, whether it's Indeed or ZipRecruiter or whatever job board of their preference. And we're also about equipping our leaders with the tools to be able to interview, right? Because it's not always enough to give people, 1,000 candidates and say, here you go, here's a talent pool. If we can't evaluate those people effectively, then we're not going to be able to make good hiring decisions, and we may not be able to retain those people. So it's about making it easy for candidates and then trying to empower our leaders to make good decisions.
Yeah, I love that. And so, do you find because you're making it so easy for people to apply that you have lower intent workers, right? Because the extreme is if you make it so it takes 10 minutes to apply, then everyone that applies likely is interested and will show up at least for the first interview. When you make it a 30-second process, you may, I think in theory, like get very low intent, kind of like the people who are going to apply, and moving quickly through the motion. How do you balance that? Like, what do you think through?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that with our industry, there are a lot of applicants to every role. We definitely don't struggle with the pipeline. And I think for our team members, that's an entry-level position. So we don't expect there to be any kind of relevant experience. Experience is helpful, but it's not the end-all be-all. But I do think that comes into play more when you do look at our management positions, those roles that do require more experience. And so we've taken the approach of, our talent pool is so diverse. With restaurant operators, we get people who have worked in retail leadership. We get people who have been restaurant executives for other companies. So it's really diverse, the people that apply. So we're trying to build in filtering mechanisms at the human level. So training our people, again, to understand what constitutes the right kind of talent to be able to look at those resumes.
Yep.
And I think because we're growing so fast, we haven't put as many filters into that process yet, just because we want to make sure we have a wide reach, especially as we open into new markets.
Yeah, right. So like when you're opening up a restaurant, you need to get people in there. And then over time, as you build the culture and all those things, you feel like you can be more refined of who comes, right? Because how many people are in each individual restaurant?
Yeah, so when we open a location, we typically hire between 100 and 125 people.
Wow.
Once the dust settles, because our openings are intense, we do a lot of volume those first few months. We normally stagnate at about 50 to 70 employees.
Okay.
And I think that's just because of our volume. We're not for everyone, and that's okay. But if folks can stick it out here and they can really learn the business and they can master those critical functions, and they can do really well here.
Right. And so out of the 100 and 125 people, how many of that is like crew members versus general managers versus shift leads? You kind of have like a rough breakdown of hourly versus not?
Sure. So in the restaurants, we have a very easy to remember structure. So I'd say about 80% of those people are non-management. So we start with our team members. Those are, the backbone of our restaurants. We couldn't do without them. Next up, we have our team member trainers, which are team members that are certified in every station. So they're able to run the fryers, the front counter, the drive-through, anything in the restaurant.
Right.
Then becomes our management level. First level being shift supervisors. And this is where we get a little different from Whataburger Corporate, because we have a sort of a separate hierarchy.
Right.
Shift supervisors, their job is to run the floor. So these are the people who are motivating their team. They're keeping folks engaged. They're expediting, they're kind of driving that success. Next step is managers. They also do what shift supervisors do, but they take on a bit more of the administrative, right? So they may be creating schedules, doing a lot of the recruiting, hiring, things of that nature. And then last but not least, we have our operating partners, which is effectively the GM. And they really own the administration, but their key function is developing people, marketing for their local restaurant, and then making sure that we're able to hit our numbers and our metrics.
Yeah, I'm surprised of how big it is, right? So like that's, compared to other quick service restaurants, that's like 2 to 3 size in terms of staffing, right? So obviously them bringing you in, I think is a testament, because it's such an important part of the business, right? And I'm sure, what's the expectation of a group of that size of what turnover can be? And, what are some things you do to, once somebody's onboarded, to make sure that you hit that critical target?
Yeah, great question. Well, I will say that, we have almost 700 employees, with only having 10 locations and 2 offices, with most of those being in the field. So it really does go back to, your point of how do we find people? And then once those populations start to thin out a bit, how do we keep those folks with us and engaged? And I think that, again, goes back to that point of how do we develop our leaders to develop others? So when we hire new leaders, we start our restaurant recruiting well before we have the doors open. So the first person we hire is an operating partner. And then they come in, they learn the business of how to run our restaurants, and then we train them on, okay, now how do you manage people in the Whataburger way, right? How do you set those folks up to be successful long-term? And then from there, the idea is that would trickle down and eventually influence their teams. But for engaging our people at a holistic level, that's something which I myself have had to adjust a bit, because I actually don't come from a restaurant background. I come from tech and healthcare and some different industries where folks are motivated by different things. And what we've found is, for example, pay is not as motivating as we might think it would be. We find that people want to work where they're appreciated. There are a lot of restaurants, and we have a lot of competition out there when it comes to finding talent. So what can entice people to stay with us? And what that comes back down to is, what's the culture? And not just the corporate HR vision of what a culture is, but how does that actually tangibly manifest? How do we have important conversations? How do we reward people for their success? How do we coach people in those hard situations? I think that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you've said a few things and I want to touch on them, right? And I'm starting to see common thread amongst a lot of different operators is you have to develop that culture, and there is a kind of corporate structure of what that might look like. And you use the phrasing like the Whataburger way, right? But there's a microculture within your group, and then there's a microculture within each individual restaurant, right? Of really what culture is, right? Because I think we can do our best as leaders to establish a strong culture, but in a multi-unit setting, it's impossible to expect that all of them are going to feel exactly the same, right? There's different factors to that, right? There's geographic considerations, there's cultural considerations, there's every restaurant is kind of its own fingerprint. So when you think about culture, how do you manage that? Like, how do you tackle that bear?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? How do you drive culture?
Right.
I think at the organizational level, so kind of from the top down, we have our core values. And these values, would be transparency, trust, integrity, respect, excellence. I think I've added a value in there, but that's not on our formal list, but it's one of them.
Right.
So those are the factors we look for in our leaders. Our leaders need to embody those traits. And to your point, in our corporate office, I can try to drive, let's make sure we're doing X, Y, and Z to build a positive environment. But it does come down to our operators. Every single restaurant is different, even if they're next door to each other, because it comes down to the team that's in place. So our strategy is, again, going back from the top down, we have to make sure that our leaders understand what good and bad looks like. Also knowing that their restaurant will not be the same as another restaurant. So it's okay to have that difference. But ultimately, people have to want to come to work every day. They want to feel like they're appreciated and they're valued. They may not love their job. We don't all love our jobs. That's okay. But that value needs to be there. And then you have to be able to provide your team the tools to succeed. So you have to be able to provide them that training, that coaching in a way that doesn't feel reductive. So again, it goes back to those values.
Right. And that I feel like you it applies to both your current job and your previous roles in more of like technology and some of the other things that you mentioned, right? But what are some things that once you got into the restaurant space and you started to hire kind of like this level of employee, the hourly workers, like what were some things, maybe even stories of things that really jarred you, that really took you by surprise and was kind of like your welcome to varsity moment, like things are no longer the same sort of thing?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think so before I went into restaurants, I was actually consulting when I went into the industry.
Right.
I was a corporate recruiter for a large mining company, and I was recruiting specifically general counsels, IT directors, very high level positions. And then I did a complete 180 with them when I was recruiting for restaurant roles. So I think what really shocked me was just the volume of people that you can speak with versus the volume of people that actually start the role. And I think that just goes back to the options people have. I think from a candidate perspective, if I'm going on a job board and I look at all of the openings for let's say a restaurant manager, there are thousands. I can really have my pick of whatever I want. So I think that places even more of an emphasis on how do we wow people and really get them hooked. How do we make people think that, okay, this seems different. This seems like a place where I could really enjoy working. And I think that's an ever evolving process, right? Because people change and people's needs are different. But I think for me, that was the biggest wow moment.
Yeah, I totally get that. I had a similar experience where we ran a report with a number of very large customers, and we're trying to figure out how many people do you have to talk to hire one, right? And when you're going for general counselors, VP of marketings, and developers, maybe it's like 10. Like you recruit 10, you have 10 conversation with 10 different people, and you're able to convince one of them to come and work for you. And that's great, right? With hourly workers, what we found was it takes 100 applicants to get 3 people to say yes to the job, and only one of them will make it to day 90. Right?
That sounds about right.
Any thoughts on that? Yeah, is that about right?
No, that's about right. I will say that. So one thing I've been very impressed with this franchise is that our operators, they really know what they're doing. Those people make my job a lot easier.
Good.
As it stands, about 3 months ago, not 3 months ago, 3 weeks ago, our average applicant to hire ratio was 8-1 through Indeed.
Oh, wow.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know the exact ratio for hire to start. My impression is that might be a little larger, or a little smaller. But I think
so like to hire, that's like offer, like you sent them an offer letter and hope it comes back. Yeah.
Correct. That means that we've extended the offer and they've started onboarding.
Yeah, and like what's interesting just is I see a lot of changes to job board kind of success metrics and monetization is like the cost per blank is constantly shifting, right? It's like cost per click, cost per impression, cost per hire. And, it's interesting just to see and hear people like you talking, because usually we end our funnel at whatever they define as success, right? So like you right there, like, hey, the funnel, we're working everything towards that higher metric, right? Where it's interesting to hear a lot of different operators have that be at different steps in the hiring motion. Where what I think of immediately, I don't know if it's right or wrong, is like the funnel should end at the 90-day mark, right? And that's where we should measure all success factors. And as I'm sure, like in the beginning when you open a restaurant, it's number of people you can get into shift, right? Like that is the true end of the funnel. And then as the business and locations mature, that's when it gets into how many people can get to 90-day, right? Because when you look at it from 90-day, what I find is you look at the entire hiring motion very differently. So if you have 1,000 people that start and like 3 people only make it to 90-day, like those metrics are bad. So you start going after different types of people. You switch up where you're sourcing applicants versus like if you get 100 people to apply and 10 of them you send an offer letter to and only 1 person shows up, it's like, that's not good, right? So it's like constantly auditing ourselves as we improve our processes to get rid of the kinks and really try to optimize towards like, what is the end goal here? And I'm excited to kind of hear like as your hiring process evolves and you guys grow so many units, what that ends up being. Because day 90 too, that's kind of arbitrary. Like, why is it day 90? Why isn't it 1 year? Why isn't it 5 years? So interested to see kind of how you guys end up there.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's so important. We can't just look at the hiring funnel as you would in some other industries, because to your point, there is that turnover. Right. And I go back to bragging on our operators, because I think I read a number a few weeks ago that the average restaurant industry turnover, I think, is 150%.
Yep.
Or 180.
Yeah.
The last metrics we ran, which were a few months ago, our average turnover was 75%, which is still not wonderful. But in comparison to how a lot of our competitors are doing, it shows that we have some of the right people in the right places.
Definitely.
And for our manager turnover, we've actually only turned over 1 operating partner in the past year. So we've been holding our senior leadership team together at the restaurant level. So we're hoping to continue that and grow more people up to kind of adopt their methods of doing things.
Love it. Well, congratulations on all of that. And we are past time. So I'm going to ask one question that I ask everybody. What was your first hourly job? And did you leave it or were you fired from that job?
My first hourly job, I was a cashier at a grocery store. And I did leave that job.
On good terms?
Yes, on good terms. I gave my 2 weeks notice. I was a good employee. I wound up moving, so I moved, and it didn't make sense to drive an hour and a half to a grocery store at the time.
Well, Preston, thank you so much for joining the podcast. If somebody wanted to learn more about you or your group, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I'm the only Preston Sharpston out there that I know of. So if you search that on LinkedIn, you'll pop me up. And our company page is MWB Restaurants. Would love to have you follow us.
All right, awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, Preston. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You as well.